Captain Marcus Blacktide Sullivan had seen dying creatures before, but something about the skeletal horse trembling on Devil's Cove made him stop in his tracks. His crew of hardened pirates erupted in laughter when he ordered them to build a shelter from driftwood and canvas. They mocked him further when he shared his own rations with the starving animal, calling him soft behind his back. But this wasn't just any horse. Within days, the creature displayed an intelligence that stunned even the most seasoned sailors. It seemed to understand their conversations, anticipated storms before they hit, and showed a loyalty that put most men to shame. As their ship faced the deadliest challenges the Caribbean had ever thrown at them, this unlikely bond would transform from an act of compassion into the crew's greatest weapon. But could one horse really change the fate of an entire pirate crew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The brass compass in Captain Sullivan's weathered palm had belonged to his father, a merchant sailor who'd taught him that true north wasn't always magnetic north. Sometimes the right direction required looking beyond what seemed logical. As he stood on the black sand of Devil's Cove, watching his crew reluctantly approach the dying horse, Marcus felt that familiar tug of moral certainty his father had called the deeper compass. "Captain, we ain't got supplies to spare for a bag of bones," growled First Mate Willem Hartwell, his scarred face twisted with disapproval. The sun carved harsh shadows across his weathered features, highlighting the permanent scowl that had intimidated enemies across 3 seas. The horse lay on its side, ribs visible through matted brown coat, breathing shallow and labored. Its eyes, though clouded with exhaustion, tracked Sullivan's movement with an intelligence that made him pause. Those weren't the vacant stares of a dying animal. There was awareness there, calculation, perhaps even hope. "Tobias, bring fresh water from the ship's barrels," Sullivan commanded, ignoring Willem's protest. "Easy with it, small sips." Young Tobias Fletcher, barely 18 and still green around the gills from his first year at sea, scrambled toward their longboat with the enthusiasm of someone grateful for clear orders. The boy had joined them in Port Royal, running from debts and a father's disappointment, seeking the freedom that only the open ocean could provide. "This is madness, Captain," muttered Jorge Santos, the ship's cook, whose massive frame and gentle hands had earned him the nickname Gentle Giant among the crew. "We barely got enough feed for the chickens, and you want to take on a horse?" Sullivan knelt beside the animal, noting the quality of its build, despite the obvious starvation. This wasn't some common workhorse. The bone structure spoke of breeding, of care, of value. Someone had loved this creature once. "Look at its hooves," he said quietly, gesturing for the crew to examine the animal more closely, filed and shaped by an expert farrier. "See the muscle structure under all that malnutrition. This horse was trained, probably for years." The horse lifted its head slightly as Tobias returned with the water bucket. Sullivan cupped his hands, offering small amounts of liquid, watching as the animal drank with measured control. Even in its weakened state, it showed discipline. "What kind of horse shows up on Devil's Cove?" asked Red Jenny, the only woman in their crew, her auburn hair catching the Caribbean sun. She'd earned her place through skill with both blade and cannon, but her voice carried a note of superstition that resonated with several crew members. Sullivan had wondered the same thing. Devil's Cove was marked on every decent map as a place to avoid. The currents were treacherous, the landing difficult, and local legends spoke of ships that vanished without explanation. Yet here they were, having made an emergency stop to repair storm damage to their mainmast. And here was this horse. "Maybe someone marooned it here," suggested Pablo Vega, their youngest crew member after Tobias. "Left it to die as punishment. Or maybe," said Willem darkly, "it's a trap, bait to draw good-hearted fools into danger." As if understanding the conversation, the horse struggled to lift its head higher, fixing its gaze directly on Sullivan. The captain felt an odd jolt of recognition, though he'd never seen this animal before in his life. "Help me get it to the boat," Sullivan decided. "We'll rig a sling, take it slow." Captain Willem stepped closer, lowering his voice to the tone he used for private counsel. "The crew's already grumbling about short rations after that storm cost us 3 days. Taking on a dying horse won't improve morale." Sullivan looked at his first mate, understanding the practical concerns, but feeling the pull of something deeper. His father's compass seemed to grow warmer in his pocket, as if responding to his internal struggle. "Sometimes, Willem, the right course isn't the easiest one. Help me with the sling." It took 6 men and considerable ingenuity to create a rope harness that could lift the horse without causing further injury. Throughout the process, the animal remained remarkably calm, as if it understood they were trying to help. When they finally managed to get it aboard their longboat, it settled with a soft whinny that sounded almost like gratitude. As they rowed back toward the Midnight's Revenge, their 3-masted brigantine anchored in the cove's deeper water. Sullivan noticed the horse watching the shoreline with what appeared to be relief. Whatever had happened to bring it to Devil's Cove, the animal seemed grateful to be leaving. "What do we call it?" asked Tobias, who had appointed himself the horse's guardian during the short voyage to their ship. Sullivan studied the animal's intelligent eyes, thinking of the courage it must have taken to survive alone on that desolate island. "Storm," he said finally. "We'll call him Storm." The ancient beam of driftwood that Jorge hauled from the ship's cargo hold told stories in its weathered grain. Sullivan recognized it immediately as part of a ship's keel, probably Spanish by the craftsmanship, worn smooth by decades of Caribbean storms. They'd salvaged it months ago, thinking it might serve for emergency repairs, but now it would become the foundation of something unprecedented aboard a pirate vessel. "You want us to build what, exactly?" Willem stared at the captain, as if he'd announced plans to sprout wings and fly to Jamaica. "A shelter," Sullivan repeated patiently, watching Storm lying on the deck where they'd carefully positioned him in the shade of the mainmast. The horse's breathing had steadied since coming aboard, but his ribs still showed starkly through his dull coat. "Something to keep him dry and give him space to recover." Red Jenny ran her calloused fingers along the driftwood beam, testing its strength. "This timber's solid enough, Captain. Been seasoned by salt water better than any carpenter could manage." She looked up with grudging respect. "If we're doing this fool thing, we might as well do it proper." The crew gathered around as Sullivan sketched his plan in the sand they kept scattered on deck for traction. Using the beam as a central support, they could construct a lean-to against the ship's rail, creating a space roughly 8 feet by 6 feet. Large enough for the horse to lie down, small enough not to interfere with ship operations. "We'll need canvas from the spare sails," he explained, his finger tracing the outline. "Rope for lashing, and we can use those extra water barrels to create walls on 2 sides." Storm lifted his head at the sound of planning, his dark eyes following the gestures as if he understood every word. Tobias had positioned himself near the horse's head, offering occasional sips of water and gentle words of encouragement. "The lad's gotten attached already," observed Pablo, nodding toward Tobias. "Been talking to that horse like it was his long-lost brother." "Animals understand more than most people think," Tobias said defensively. "My grandmother always said horses could read a man's heart better than his wife could." Jorge laughed, a deep rumble from his barrel chest. "Your grandmother was a wise woman, boy. I've seen horses refuse to carry men who meant them harm, even when those men seemed perfectly kind to humans." As they began gathering materials, Storm struggled to his feet for the first time since coming aboard. The effort clearly cost him, his legs trembling with weakness, but he managed to stand and take a few tentative steps toward where they were working. "Look at that," whispered Red Jenny. "He knows we're building something for him." The horse moved slowly along the deck, inspecting the driftwood beam with obvious interest. When he reached it, he lowered his head and sniffed carefully, then looked directly at Sullivan with what could only be described as approval. "I'll be damned," muttered Willem, despite himself. "It's like he's checking our work." The construction took most of the afternoon. The crew worked with surprising enthusiasm once they began, each man contributing skills learned from years of ship maintenance and repair. The driftwood beam proved perfect for the job, its curved shape following the natural line of the ship's hull. Pablo, who had the steadiest hands among them, lashed the canvas with intricate knots that would hold against Caribbean winds. Jorge positioned the water barrels with the precision of someone who understood weight distribution on a moving vessel. Even Willem, grumbling throughout, curded practical suggestions about drainage and ventilation. "We'll need to secure it extra tight," Willem said, testing the rope tension. First rough sea and this whole contraption could slide right overboard, horse and all. Storm watched every stage of the construction with intense focus, occasionally nickering softly when the work pleased him, or tossing his head when something didn't meet his standards. His reactions were so specific that the crew began consulting him before making final adjustments. "Never seen anything like it," admitted Jorge, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That horse has opinions about everything we're doing." By sunset they had completed a sturdy shelter that would have impressed any ship's carpenter. The driftwood beam formed a strong central support. The canvas roof was taut and waterproof, and the barrel walls provided protection from wind while allowing air circulation. Storm approached his new home cautiously, sniffing at every surface before stepping inside. He turned around once, testing the space, then settled down on the soft straw they'd spread across the floor, with a contented sigh. "Well," said Willem, surveying their work with grudging satisfaction, "if we're going to do something this foolish, at least we've done it right." Sullivan smiled, watching his crew admire their handiwork. The shelter represented more than practical construction. It was the first time he'd seen them work together on something purely compassionate, without thought of profit or advantage. "Good work, men," Storm approved. The silver bucket had once held doubloons from a Spanish treasure ship, its ornate surface bearing the coat of arms of some long-forgotten nobleman. Now it served a nobler purpose, filled twice daily with fresh water and the best grain they could spare from their dwindling stores. Sullivan carried it himself each morning and evening, despite Willem's increasingly vocal protests about their supplies. "That horse eats better than half the crew," Willem complained, watching Sullivan measure out another portion of oats. "And those are the last of the good grain we took from that merchant vessel." Sullivan ignored the grumbling, focusing on Storm's remarkable transformation. In just 3 days, the horse had gained strength and alertness that defied explanation. His coat, while still rough, had begun to show hints of its natural luster. More importantly, his eyes had lost that clouded look of despair and now held a sharp intelligence that made conversations feel oddly one-sided. "Morning, Storm," Sullivan said, setting the silver bucket within reach. "Sleep well?" The horse nickered softly, a sound that had become as much a part of the ship's morning routine as the bell marking the watch change. Storm approached the bucket with dignified steps, no longer the desperate gulping of a starving animal, but the measured eating of a creature who knew his needs would be met. Tobias appeared at Sullivan's elbow, as he did every morning, eager to help with Storm's care. The boy had taken to sleeping near the shelter, claiming he wanted to monitor the horse's recovery. But Sullivan suspected a deeper attachment was forming. "He knew you were coming before you appeared on deck," Tobias reported excitedly. "Started moving toward the bucket before he could see you. It's like he can sense your footsteps from below." Sullivan had noticed similar behaviors. Storm seemed aware of the ship's routines in ways that suggested more than casual observation. When the crew prepared to change the watch, Storm would lift his head expectantly, as if anticipating the bell. Before meals he would turn toward the galley, somehow knowing when Jorge began preparing food. "Animals have better instincts than humans," Sullivan said, though privately he wondered if instinct alone could explain Storm's behavior. "They pick up on things we miss." Red Jenny joined them, carrying a brush she'd fashioned from rope fibers and wood shavings. "Mind if I work on his coat, Captain? That matted hair's got to be uncomfortable in this heat." Storm's reaction to Jenny's approach was telling. While he'd grown comfortable with Sullivan and Tobias, he remained wary of most crew members. But something about Jenny's calm demeanor and gentle movements seemed to win his trust immediately. He stood perfectly still as she began working through the tangles in his mane, occasionally turning his head to watch her progress with approval. "You've got the touch, Jenny," observed Jorge, who had come up from the galley with his usual morning bucket of scraps for the chickens. "That horse is particular about who he allows close." The cook was right. Storm had definite preferences among the crew. He tolerated Pablo's youthful enthusiasm and seemed amused by the boy's attempts at conversation. Willem, however, received cool indifference, as if Storm sensed the first mate's skepticism about his presence. Most intriguingly, Storm had begun ruining to spoken instructions. When Sullivan asked him to move aside so they could clean his shelter, the horse complied immediately. When Tobias suggested he drink more water during the hot afternoon, Storm would approach the bucket even if he'd shown no previous interest. "It's unnatural," Willem muttered, watching Storm step carefully around a coil of rope that Jorge was arranging on deck. No animal's that smart without something strange about it. Sullivan was beginning to wonder if Willem might be right, though not in the way the first mate intended. Storm's intelligence seemed to extend beyond normal animal behavior into something approaching human-like reasoning. He'd seen the horse study the crew's work with obvious interest, turning his head to follow conversations as if trying to understand their meaning. That afternoon, as Sullivan shared his own lunch with Storm, cutting up ship's biscuit and offering pieces from his hand, he felt the weight of curious stares from the crew. Sharing rations with an animal went against every practical instinct of survival at sea, yet something about Storm made the sacrifice feel necessary. "You understand more than you let on, don't you?" Sullivan said quietly, offering another piece of biscuit. Storm's response was to nuzzle Sullivan's shoulder gently, a gesture of affection that felt remarkably human in its deliberate nature. The touch carried weight beyond simple animal gratitude. It felt like acknowledgement, like the beginning of a partnership that would extend far beyond simple rescue and recovery. As evening fell and Sullivan prepared Storm's dinner in the silver bucket, he found himself looking forward to these quiet moments. The horse's presence had begun to change something aboard the Midnight's Revenge, though he couldn't yet name what that change might mean. The ship's bell had rung the morning watch for 15 years without fail, its bronze surface green with age and salt spray. But on the 5th day since Storm's arrival, something extraordinary happened. As Pablo reached for the rope to signal the watch change, Storm lifted his head from his shelter and released a sharp whinny that perfectly matched the bell's tone. "Did you hear that?" Tobias asked, looking around at the crew with wide eyes. He sang along with the bell. Jorge paused in his breakfast preparations, ladle suspended over the porridge pot. "Horses don't sing, boy. They whinny, they neigh, they snort. They don't make music." But even as the cook spoke, Storm approached the bell rope that hung within reach of his shelter. Using his teeth, he grasped it gently and gave a single, measured pull. The bell rang once, clear and true, across the morning air. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," whispered Red Jenny, crossing herself. "That horse just rang the watch." Sullivan watched in amazement as Storm released the rope and turned to look at him expectantly, as if waiting for approval. The intelligence in those dark eyes was unmistakable now, moving far beyond animal instinct into something approaching human reasoning. "Show me again," Sullivan said quietly. Storm tilted his head, considering the request, then stepped toward the bell rope. This time he rang it twice, paused, then once more. 3 clear notes that seemed to echo the pattern of the morning watch signal. Willem backed away from the scene, his scarred face pale beneath his weathered tan. "Captain, this ain't natural. Animals don't understand bells and watches and signals." But Pablo, ever eager to test boundaries, had pulled an apple from his pocket. "If he understands the bell," the young pirate said excitedly, "maybe he understands other things too." He held up the apple where Storm could see it, then pointed toward the ship's bow. "Go fetch the apple, Storm." Instead of simply moving toward the fruit, Storm studied Pablo's gesture carefully, following the direction of his pointing finger. Then, with deliberate steps, he walked to the bow, turned around, and looked back expectantly. Pablo tossed the apple in a gentle arc. Storm moved with surprising grace for an animal still recovering from starvation, positioning himself perfectly to catch the fruit before it hit the deck. "That's not possible," Jorge said flatly. "You can't teach a horse to catch things out of the air. Their eyes don't work that way." But Storm was already demonstrating more impossible behaviors. When Red Jenny accidentally dropped her knife while mending sail, Storm immediately moved to stand over it, preventing it from sliding across the tilting deck toward the rail. "He's protecting it," she said in wonder, bending to retrieve the blade. He knew it would go overboard. The demonstrations continued throughout the morning. When clouds began gathering on the horizon, still too distant for the crew to notice, Storm moved restlessly around the deck, eventually positioning himself at the ship's weather rail and staring intently at the approaching storm system. "Look where he's watching," Sullivan said, following Storm's gaze. "Those clouds are at least 2 hours away, but he's already tracking them." As if to confirm Sullivan's observation, Storm moved to the bell rope again. This time he rang it in a rapid pattern, 3 quick notes, pause, 3 more, pause, then a long sustained ring. "That's the storm warning signal," Willem said, his voice tight with unease. "How does he know our warning signal?" Sullivan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the approaching weather. Storm's knowledge seemed to extend beyond intelligent observation into areas that should have been impossible for any animal to comprehend. The horse wasn't finished demonstrating his ability. When Tobias struggled with a knot in the rigging, Storm approached and, using his teeth with surgical precision, loosened the exact strand that would free the tangle. "He's reading the rope work," Tobias said in amazement. "He can see how the knot's supposed to come apart." By noon, the crew had gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about Storm's impossible demonstrations. Some, like Tobias and Jenny, watched with fascination. Others, including Willem and several of the older hands, kept their distance with obvious unease. "It's like he's been sailing for years," Pablo said, watching Storm anticipate the ship's roll and adjust his stance accordingly. "Like he knows everything about how a ship works." Sullivan found himself studying Storm with new eyes, seeing not just an rescued animal, but something far more complex and mysterious. The horse moved through the ship's daily routines with the confidence of an experienced sailor, understanding systems and signals that should have taken years to learn. As the approaching storm began to darken the sky, Storm rang the bell again, this time in the precise pattern used to call all hands on deck for emergency preparations. The storm lantern that Jorge had secured to the mainmast flickered wildly as the Caribbean tempest descended upon them with the fury of an angry god. Waves the size of church steeples crashed over the bow of the Midnight's Revenge, sending torrents of seawater cascading across the deck. Through it all, Storm stood calmly in his shelter, watching the crew battle the elements with an expression that seemed almost knowing, all hands secure for heavy weather. Sullivan shouted over the howling wind, his voice barely audible above the storm's roar. Lightning split the sky in jagged silver lines, illuminating the chaos of men struggling to reef the sails before they tore apart. Willem fought his way across the slippery deck, salt spray stinging his eyes as he wrestled with a loose line that threatened to tear free from its cleat. Behind him, Pablo and 2 other crew members hauled desperately on the main sheet, their boots sliding on the water-slicked planking. That's when disaster struck. A massive wave, larger than any they'd yet encountered, rose like a green mountain above the ship's starboard rail. It crashed down with the force of a falling building, sweeping Pablo off his feet and sending him sliding toward the churning ocean. "Man overboard!" Red Jenny screamed, but her words were lost in the wind. Pablo's fingers clawed desperately at the smooth deck planking, finding no purchase on the wet surface. He slid inexorably toward the rail, the dark waters beyond promising certain death in the mountainous seas. Then Storm moved. With a grace that defied the ship's violent pitching, the horse stepped out of his shelter and placed himself directly in Pablo's path. The young pirate collided with Storm's solid flank, the impact stopping his deadly slide toward the ocean. "Hold on to it," Sullivan shouted, seeing Pablo's arms wrap around Storm's front legs. But the horse wasn't finished. As another massive wave prepared to sweep across the deck, Storm carefully walked backward, dragging Pablo away from the rail toward the relative safety of the ship's center. His movements were deliberate and calculated, each step timed to the ship's motion with the skill of a veteran sailor. "Impossible," Willem gasped, watching the rescue unfold. No animal can read waves like that. Storm proved him wrong again. As the next wave approached, the horse lowered his head and trumpeted a warning that somehow carried above the storm's noise. The crew, trained by years at sea to heed any warning of danger, instinctively grabbed for handholds just as the waves struck. The wall of water that would have swept 3 more men overboard instead found the crew prepared, clinging to rigging and rails while the sea vented its fury harmlessly around them. "He's reading the waves," Tobias shouted to Sullivan, his young voice cracking with amazement. "He's warning us before each big one hits." Indeed, Storm had positioned himself where he could see both the approaching swells and the entire crew. Each time a particularly dangerous wave built on the horizon, he would sound his warning trumpet, giving the men precious seconds to prepare. Jorge, struggling to secure the storm lantern that threatened to break free and start a fire, found unexpected help when Storm moved to shield the light with his body. The horse stood perfectly still as the cook worked, creating a windbreak that allowed Jorge to complete the critical task. "Even knows about fire safety," Jorge muttered, patting Storm's neck gratefully. For 2 hours the tempest raged around them with biblical intensity. Through it all, Storm remained a steady presence on the chaotic deck, anticipating dangers before they materialized and positioning himself to help wherever needed most. When young Tobias lost his footing near the bow, Storm was there to block his slide. When a loose piece of rigging threatened to brain Red Jenny, Storm's warning whinny made her duck just in time. When the storm lantern finally did break free from its mounting, Storm carefully caught the falling lamp in his teeth and carried it to safety. "It's like he's the finest sailor among us," Red Jenny observed during a brief lull in the wind. "Better than some men I've sailed with." As dawn finally broke through the dissipating clouds, the crew gathered on deck to assess the damage. By all rights, they should have lost men to the violent seas. Instead, every soul aboard was accounted for, largely due to Storm's impossible interventions. Pablo approached the horse with tears in his eyes, still shaken from his near-death experience. "You saved my life," he said simply, pressing his forehead against Storm's neck. "I owe you everything." Storm's response was a gentle nicker, as if to say such debts were unnecessary between shipmates. Sullivan stood watching his crew interact with their unlikely savior, realizing that everything had changed during the night's ordeal. Storm was no longer a rescued animal they were caring for out of pity. He had become something far more valuable and mysterious. The braided rope halter that Red Jenny presented to Storm 3 days after the tempest was a work of art, woven from the finest hemp aboard the ship and decorated with small brass fittings, salvaged from their treasure stores. Each crew member had contributed something to its creation. Jorge provided the leather padding for comfort, Tobias added decorative knots he'd learned from his grandmother, and even Willem had grudgingly offered brass buckles from his personal kit. "It ain't much," Jenny said, approaching Storm with the halter held respectfully in both hands. "But we wanted you to have something proper, something that shows you belong here." Storm examined the gift with the careful attention he gave to everything, sniffing delicately at the ropework and testing the brass fittings with his lips. Then, in a gesture that surprised everyone, he lowered his head and stepped forward, clearly inviting Jenny to fit the halter around his neck. "Well, I'll be damned," Willem muttered, watching the ceremony with grudging respect. "He knows what it means." The halter transformed Storm's appearance from rescued animal to valued crew member. The brass fittings caught the Caribbean sun, and the expert ropework emphasized the noble lines of his head and neck. More importantly, it represented the crew's acceptance of his permanent place aboard the Midnight's Revenge. Storm's integration into ship operations had become seamless in the days following the storm. He had appointed himself unofficial watchkeeper during the night hours, standing alert in his shelter while the crew slept. More than once, his warning nicker had alerted the night watch to approaching ships or dangerous weather changes hours before human senses would have detected them. "He's better than any lookout we've ever had," Pablo admitted, checking the ship's compass against Storm's behavior. "When he turns his head toward something on the horizon, there's always something worth seeing there." The horse had also begun helping with daily maintenance tasks in ways that defied explanation. When Jorge struggled to move heavy water barrels, Storm would position himself to help push or pull. When Red Jenny worked on sail repairs, Storm would hold sections of canvas steady with his teeth, freeing her hands for the intricate stitching. Most remarkably, Storm had begun participating in the ship's security. During their approach to Port Royal the previous week, he had become visibly agitated when certain dock workers came aboard, pawing the deck and snorting warnings. Sullivan had initially dismissed the behavior as nervousness around strangers, but later discovered that the same dock workers had been caught stealing from other ships. "It's like he can read people's intentions," Tobias observed, watching Storm calmly accept attention from honest merchants while remaining wary of those with questionable motives. "He knows who to trust before we do." The crew had adapted their routines to accommodate Storm's participation. During weapons practice, he would move to a safe distance but remain watchful, as if studying their techniques. When they sang work songs to coordinate heavy lifting, Storm would add his voice at appropriate moments, creating harmonies that made the work feel lighter. Sullivan found himself consulting Storm on decisions that had nothing to do with the horse directly. When choosing between two possible courses to avoid a Spanish patrol, he would explain both options aloud, watching Storm's reaction. Invariably, the horse's preferences aligned with the most successful outcomes. "You're treating him like an officer," Willem observed one evening, watching Sullivan share his evening meal with Storm. "Next thing you know, you'll be asking his opinion on navigation." Sullivan laughed, but privately wondered if Willem's joke might not be far from the truth. Storm's understanding of seamanship continued to exceed that of many veteran sailors. He could predict weather changes, spot other ships at extreme distances, and sense dangerous currents before instruments detected them. The transformation in crew morale was equally remarkable. Arguments that had once festered for days were now settled more quickly, as if Storm's presence reminded them of larger purposes. Men who had barely spoken to each other began working together more effectively, united by their shared wonder at their unusual shipmate. Even practical matters had improved. Their stores lasted longer because Storm somehow knew how to make their supplies stretch further, nudging Jorge toward more efficient meal preparations. Their navigation was more accurate because Storm's weather sense allowed them to avoid costly detours around storm systems. "He's brought us luck," Red Jenny declared one morning, watching Storm carefully inspect a section of rigging that had been repaired the previous day. "Good luck like I've never seen aboard any ship," Sullivan nodded, though he suspected Storm's contribution went beyond mere luck into something approaching wisdom. The horse had become the heart of their small community, a living reminder that loyalty and intelligence could take forms they had never imagined possible. The black flag with its grinning skull and crossed cutlasses fluttered ominously against the morning sky, visible even at 3 miles distance through Sullivan's spyglass. But it was Storm who had spotted the approaching vessel first, his head raised high and ears pricked forward with unmistakable tension, staring fixedly at a point on the horizon where human eyes saw only empty ocean. "What is it, boy?" Sullivan had asked, following the horse's gaze before reaching for his telescope. Now, studying the distant ship through the lens, Sullivan felt his blood run cold. The vessel was the Crimson Serpent, captained by the most vicious pirate in Caribbean waters, Eduardo Iron Teeth Rodriguez, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among the lawless brotherhood of the sea. "All hands on deck," Sullivan bellowed, snapping the spyglass shut. "Prepare for possible engagement." The crew responded with practiced efficiency, but Sullivan noticed Storm's unusual behavior throughout the preparations. The horse moved restlessly around the deck, pausing at various positions as if calculating angles and distances. His nostrils flared constantly, testing the wind direction, and his ears swiveled to track sounds that human hearing couldn't detect. That's Rodriguez's ship, Willem confirmed, studying the approaching vessel through his own glass. The Crimson Serpent, fast as lightning and twice as deadly. Red Jenny checked the priming on her pistols, her face grim with concentration. Rodriguez doesn't take prisoners, Captain, and he's got a special hatred for anyone who's crossed him before. Sullivan nodded, remembering their last encounter with Iron Teeth Rodriguez 18 months ago. They had escaped that meeting by the skin of their teeth, but not before Rodriguez had sworn vengeance against the crew of the Midnight's Revenge. Storm approached Sullivan and pressed his nose against the captain's shoulder, a gesture that had become his way of offering comfort or warning. This time the touch carried urgency. "You sense it too, don't you?" Sullivan murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "This isn't going to be a simple chase." Jorge emerged from the galley carrying extra powder charges, his normally cheerful face set in lines of concern. "That ship's gained on us in the last quarter hour, Captain. She's carrying more sail than should be possible in this wind." Indeed, the Crimson Serpent was closing distance with supernatural speed, her black sails billowing full despite the light breeze that barely filled the Midnight's Revenge's canvas. Rodriguez was renowned for his ship's unnatural abilities, though most attributed them to superior seamanship rather than darker influences. Storm suddenly trumpeted a warning, the sound carrying clearly across the water. Almost immediately, the distant ship altered course slightly, as if responding to the call. "Did Rodriguez hear that?" Tobias asked, his young voice tight with worry. "Are they changing direction because of storm?" Pablo squinted across the water, shading his eyes against the sun's glare. "Look at their bow. They're turning to intercept our current heading." Sullivan felt a chill of realization. Rodriguez wasn't just pursuing them randomly. The rival captain was anticipating their movements with the precision of someone who understood their capabilities intimately. "How long since Rodriguez last saw us?" Sullivan asked Willem, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Port Royal, 6 months ago. But he kept his distance then, didn't engage." "He was studying us," Sullivan said grimly, "learning our patterns, our speed, our tactics." Storm moved to the ship's rail, standing at the exact spot where he had the clearest view of the approaching enemy. His posture was alert, but not panicked, like a veteran soldier assessing battlefield conditions. "He's not afraid," Red Jenny observed, watching Storm's steady demeanor. "Whatever he senses about that ship, it's not scaring him." The observation proved prescient. As the Crimson Serpent drew closer, Storm's behavior became increasingly confident. He moved around the deck with purpose, positioning himself at various strategic points, as if planning defensive measures. "Captain," Tobias called from the rigging. "Storm's acting like he knows what's coming." Sullivan watched his unusual crew member with growing amazement. Storm was studying the approaching ship with the intensity of an experienced naval tactician, his head turning to track wind patterns, current flows, and the enemy vessel's approach angle. When Rodriguez's ship closed to within a mile, Storm released another trumpeting call, this one different from his warning sound. It carried across the water with clarion clarity, and Sullivan could have sworn he saw movement on the enemy deck in response. "What kind of horse challenges a pirate ship?" Willem asked, but his tone held admiration rather than criticism. The kind, Sullivan realized, that had been waiting for this moment. The cannonball that came screaming across the water should have punched through the Midnight's Revenge's hull like paper. But Storm had other plans. As the iron sphere arced toward their starboard side, the horse reared up on his hind legs and struck out with his front hooves, connecting with the projectile in mid-flight and deflecting it harmlessly into the sea. The impact left a distinctive horseshoe-shaped dent in the cannonball's surface as it splashed down, creating a moment of stunned silence on both ships. "Did that horse just kick a cannonball?" Red Jenny gasped, her pistol forgotten in her hand. "Madre de Dios," whispered Jorge, crossing himself rapidly. "I've seen everything now, but there was no time for amazement." The Crimson Serpent had closed to fighting distance, and Eduardo Rodriguez's voice carried clearly across the water, filled with rage and disbelief. "What manner of devil's horse is that?" the rival captain roared. "Sink that cursed ship." The battle erupted with the fury of a Caribbean hurricane. Cannons thundered from both vessels, filling the air with smoke and deadly ire. The Midnight's Revenge responded with her own broadside, but Rodriguez's superior firepower quickly became apparent. Storm moved through the chaos with impossible grace, his hooves finding purchase on the blood-slicked deck as he dodged flying splinters and falling rigging. When another cannonball whistled toward Pablo, who was reloading one of their guns, Storm shouldered the young pirate aside and took the impact himself, deflecting the shot with his flank in a move that should have shattered every bone in his body. Instead, Storm shook himself like a dog throwing off water and returned to the fight. "He's not getting hurt," Tobias shouted over the cannon fire, watching in amazement as Storm emerged unscathed from encounters that would have killed any normal creature. "The shots aren't touching him." Sullivan saw it too. Storm wasn't just avoiding damage through luck or agility. The horse seemed to possess some supernatural protection that turned aside even direct hits. When grape shot peppered the deck around him, the deadly pellets bounced off his hide like raindrops. But Storm wasn't content to simply survive the battle. He had become an active participant in the fighting, using his intelligence to turn the tide in ways no one could have predicted. When Willem struggled to aim one of their stern chasers, Storm positioned himself to brace the gun carriage, his weight and strength allowing the first mate to fire with deadly accuracy. The shot took out the Crimson Serpent's forward mast, sending it crashing across Rodriguez's deck in a tangle of sail and rigging. "Good shot," Sullivan called, but he knew the credit belonged to Storm's assistance. The horse had also begun coordinating the crew's movements with precision that would have impressed any naval commander. When Red Jenny needed to reload her pistols, Storm would position himself to shield her from enemy fire. When Jorge struggled to move powder charges from below decks, Storm would clear a path through the chaos with perfectly timed movements. Most remarkably, Storm had begun anticipating Rodriguez's tactics before they developed. When the Crimson Serpent attempted to come alongside for boarding, Storm trumpeted a warning that sent Sullivan's crew scrambling to defensive positions just as grappling hooks flew across the gap between ships. "He's reading their battle plans," Willem observed, watching Storm track the enemy crew's movements with tactical precision, like he's been fighting naval battles for years. The observation proved accurate when Rodriguez attempted his most dangerous gambit. The rival captain himself swung across on a rope, cutlass gleaming as he aimed for Sullivan's position near the wheel. Storm intercepted him mid-air. The collision sent Rodriguez tumbling across the deck, his cutlass spinning away into the churning water. The feared pirate captain found himself face to face with Storm, who regarded him with calm intelligence rather than animal fury. "What are you?" Rodriguez gasped, scrambling backward on hands and knees. Storm's response was to step carefully around the fallen pirate and position himself between Rodriguez and Sullivan, clearly establishing his protective intentions while offering no violence to a defeated enemy. The psychological impact on Rodriguez's crew was immediate and devastating. Seeing their legendary captain cowed by a horse broke their fighting spirit entirely. The Crimson Serpent began pulling away, her crew too shaken to continue the engagement. "Let them go," Sullivan commanded, though he suspected Storm's merciful treatment of Rodriguez had made the decision for them all. As the enemy ship limped away, Sullivan studied the dented cannonball that had started it all, now embedded in their deck railing like a trophy. The horseshoe mark was perfectly clear, physical proof of the impossible thing they had all witnessed. The poisoned apple gleamed with an unnatural sheen in the moonlight, its red skin polished to perfection and injected with enough nightshade to kill 3 men. Diego Santos, Jorge's younger brother, who had joined the crew in Tortuga, held the deadly fruit with trembling hands as he crept toward Storm's shelter in the pre-dawn darkness. Jealousy had been eating at Diego for weeks. While the rest of the crew celebrated Storm's miraculous abilities, Diego saw only a beast that had stolen his captain's attention and his brother's admiration. In Diego's twisted mind, removing the horse would restore the natural order aboard the Midnight's Revenge. "Just one bite," he whispered to himself, approaching Storm's shelter. "Animals can't resist fresh fruit." But Storm was already awake, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight as he watched Diego's approach with unmistakable awareness. The horse didn't move from his resting position, but his ears flicked forward with alert attention. Diego extended the apple with what he hoped looked like friendly generosity. "Here, boy, something special for you." Storm rose slowly to his feet, studying both Diego and the offered fruit with careful consideration. Instead of reaching for the apple with eager hunger, the horse stepped closer to Diego and sniffed delicately at the man's clothing, his hands, and finally the apple itself. The reaction was immediate and telling. Storm's head jerked back as if struck, his nostrils flaring with alarm. A low, rumbling sound emerged from deep in his chest, something between a growl and a warning nicker. "What's wrong?" Diego asked, but his voice cracked with guilt. "It's just an apple." Storm's response was to carefully knock the fruit from Diego's hands with his nose, sending it rolling across the deck toward the ship's rail. Then the horse fixed Diego, with a stare that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul.
"You don't understand," Diego said desperately, reaching for his knife. "This ship was better before you came. The captain cares more about feeding you than feeding his own crew." The accusation was false, and Storm's reaction showed he knew it. The horse stepped between Diego and the Phaeon apple, his stance protective but not aggressive. Even facing a direct threat to his life, Storm showed no desire to harm his would-be assassin. But Storm's defensive positioning had awakened others. Tobias, who still slept near the shelter most nights, stirred at the sound of voices. "Diego, what are you doing out here?" The young pirate tried to look innocent, but Storm's continued agitation made deception impossible. The horse moved to the apple and carefully picked it up in his teeth, carrying it directly to Tobias as evidence of the attempted poisoning. "Sweet Mary," Tobias gasped, recognizing the telltale shine of the toxic coating. "Diego, what have you done?" The confrontation that followed drew the entire crew from their hammocks. Sullivan examined the poisoned apple, while Diego stood trembling under the accusatory stares of his shipmates. Nightshade, Jorge confirmed, his voice heavy with sorrow at his brother's betrayal. "Enough to kill a dozen men, or one horse," Sullivan said grimly, looking at Diego with disappointment rather than anger. "Why? He's changed everything," Diego burst out, gesturing wildly at Storm. "You treat that animal better than your own crew. Share your food with him, take his advice over ours, risk our lives for his safety." "Storm saved Pablo's life in the storm," Red Jenny pointed out coldly. "Saved all our lives when Rodriguez attacked. What have you done for this crew lately besides complain?" Storm approached Diego again, but this time his manner was different. Instead of wariness, the horse showed what could only be described as pity. He nuzzled Diego's shoulder gently, a gesture of forgiveness that left the would-be assassin in tears. "He's not even angry," Diego sobbed. "I tried to kill him, and he's not even angry." Sullivan studied his crew member with the weary expression of a leader who had seen too much betrayal in his years at sea. "The penalty for attempted murder aboard this ship is death, Diego. You know that." "But Storm's vote counts too," Tobias said quietly. "And he's already cast it for mercy." The observation was accurate. Storm's gentle treatment of Diego had communicated his wishes more clearly than words. Despite the attempt on his life, the horse bore no malice toward his attacker. "Marooning then," Willem suggested. "Put him ashore at the next port with enough supplies to start over." Sullivan nodded slowly, but Storm had one more surprise. The horse walked to Diego and, using his teeth, carefully removed a gold coin from the man's pocket. Then Storm carried the coin to Sullivan and dropped it at the captain's feet. "He's paying Diego's passage," Sullivan realized, "making sure he has enough to survive on shore." Even in the face of betrayal, Storm's compassion remained absolute. The ancient treasure map that fell from the rotting beam in Storm's original shelter bore the unmistakable seal of Captain Bartholomew, Blackheart. Morgan, the most legendary pirate to ever sail Caribbean waters. The parchment was yellow with age, its edges cracked and brittle, but the intricate drawings and cryptic notations were still clearly visible in the afternoon sunlight.
Sullivan had discovered it by accident while reinforcing Storm's shelter after the battle with Rodriguez. As he moved the old driftwood beam that had served as the structure's foundation, a hollow section had cracked open, revealing the carefully preserved document within. "Look at this," he called to the crew, unrolling the map with reverent care. "This was hidden in the wood Storm was lying on when we found him." The crew gathered around as Sullivan spread the map on a makeshift table. The detail was extraordinary, showing not just an island location but careful notations about tides, currents, and seasonal wind patterns. At the center of the depicted island, an elaborate X marked the treasure's location, surrounded by warnings written in Morgan's distinctive hand. "Black Heart Morgan," Willem breathed, recognizing the pirate's seal. "He disappeared 30 years ago, with the greatest treasure hoard ever assembled. Every pirate in the Caribbean has searched for his final cache." Storm approached the map with obvious interest, studying the parchment with the same careful attention he gave to everything important. But his reaction was more than casual curiosity. The horse began tracing certain landmarks on the map with his nose, pausing at specific notations as if they held familiar significance. "He recognizes it," Tobias observed, watching Storm's behavior with growing excitement. "He knows this island." Red Jenny leaned closer to examine the map's details. "Look at these notations around the edges. They're not just navigational marks, they're warnings about guardians, about trials that must be faced to reach the treasure." Indeed, Morgan's spidery handwriting covered the map's margins with cautionary notes. References to the loyal guardian, tests of worthiness, and the bond that unlocks all doors suggested that finding Morgan's treasure involved more than simple excavation. "Here's something interesting," Jorge pointed to a section of the map showing the island's interior. "This drawing looks like a horse, not just any horse, but one with the same build as Storm." Sullivan studied the indicated area, seeing what Jorge meant. Among the detailed topographical features, Morgan had drawn what appeared to be a horse statue or monument, positioned as if guarding the approach to the treasure site. Storm's reaction to this discovery was remarkable. He carefully placed one hoof on the map, directly over the horse symbol, and looked at Sullivan with an expression that seemed to communicate volumes about his true nature and purpose. "Sweet Mother of God," whispered Pablo. "Storm belonged to Black Heart Morgan." The pieces began fitting together with startling clarity. Storm's impossible sailing knowledge, his tactical brilliance in battle, his supernatural abilities, and his presence on Devil's Cove all made sense if he had once served the greatest pirate captain in Caribbean history. "But Morgan disappeared 3 decades ago," Willem protested. "Storm's not that old." "Maybe," Sullivan said quietly, studying the horse with new understanding. "Age works differently for some creatures than it does for us." Storm confirmed this theory by moving to various points around the map and indicating specific features with precise touches of his hoof. He showed them the safest approach route, the location of fresh water, and most importantly, a series of symbols that appeared to represent challenges or tests. "He's trying to tell us something about the treasure," Red Jenny realized, "not just where it is, but how to reach it safely." The map included a detailed drawing of what appeared to be a complex mechanism or puzzle at the treasure site. Morgan's notes suggested that multiple elements had to be activated simultaneously, requiring both intelligence and loyalty to succeed. "The bond that unlocks all doors," Sullivan read aloud from Morgan's notations. Could that refer to the partnership between captain and horse? Storm's vigorous nod left no doubt about the answer. As evening fell and the crew continued studying the map by lantern light, Storm stood watch over the proceedings with protective intensity. This wasn't just any treasure map to him. It represented his own history, his purpose, and perhaps the reason he had survived alone on Devil's Cove for so long. "We have to go there," Tobias said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "This is why Storm came into our lives, to lead us to Morgan's treasure." Sullivan looked at his unusual crew member, seeing not just a rescued animal, but the last keeper of the greatest pirate legend in Caribbean history. Storm had been waiting on Devil's Cove, guarding the secret of Morgan's final treasure, until the right crew came along to complete the quest his original captain had begun decades ago. The crystal navigation stone that Storm had led them to on a remote coral reef defied all natural explanation, its translucent surface pulsing with inner light that corresponded to compass directions. Sullivan held the mystical artifact carefully, feeling its strange warmth against his palms as Storm guided their course toward Morgan's treasure island with supernatural precision. 2 points starboard, Sullivan called to Willem at the wheel, following Storm's insistent nudging toward a heading that contradicted every navigational instinct he possessed. Trust the horse. The crystal had been Storm's idea entirely. 3 days into their journey, the horse had become increasingly agitated, pawing the deck and staring at empty ocean with intense focus. When Sullivan finally lowered a boat to investigate the coral formation, Storm kept indicating they had found the crystal embedded in an ancient altar-like structure, as if placed there specifically for this moment. Now, with the mystical stone glowing brighter as they approached their destination, Sullivan understood they were navigating waters that existed beyond normal maritime charts. The sea around them had taken on an otherworldly quality, its blue-green depths seeming to pulse with the same rhythm as the crystal. "Captain, look at the water," Red Jenny called from the bow, her voice filled with wonder. "It's moving in pattern." Indeed, the ocean surface was forming spirals and geometric shapes that followed no natural current or wind pattern. The designs seemed to respond to Storm's presence, becoming more pronounced when the horse moved closer to the rail. "It's like the sea itself is welcoming us," Tobias observed, watching dolphins appear alongside their ship in numbers that defied belief. The marine creatures weren't just following their usual migration patterns, but were actively escorting the Midnight's revenge, their playful leaps creating an honor guard around the vessel. Storm had positioned himself at the bow, the crystal navigation stone somehow securing itself to his halter, through means Sullivan couldn't explain. The artifact's light had synchronized with the horse's breathing, creating a beacon that seemed to call to other mystical forces in the surrounding waters. There, Hortire pointed toward the horizon, where morning mist was beginning to reveal the outline of an island. "That has to be Morgan's treasure island." But as they drew closer, Sullivan realized this wasn't any ordinary Caribbean landmass. The island seemed to shift and shimmer, its coastline changing subtly depending on the angle of approach. Palm trees that appeared normal from a distance revealed themselves to be made of precious metals, their leaves catching sunlight with golden gleams. Storm began vocalizing as they approached the island, not his usual warning calls, but something that sounded almost like singing. The melody was haunting and beautiful, carried across the water with supernatural clarity that made the entire crew pause in their duties to listen. "He's announcing our arrival," Sullivan realized, watching other creatures respond to Storm's song. Seabirds that glowed with inner light began circling their ship, and the water around them filled with luminescent fish that swam in perfect formation. The crystal navigation stone was now blazing with light, so intense it was difficult to look at directly. Storm's connection to the artifact had become so complete that horse and crystal seemed to share the same consciousness, working together to guide them through waters that ordinary navigation could never master. "Look at the shoreline," Willem called, his voice tight with amazement. "Those aren't natural formations." The beach they were approaching was made of what appeared to be crushed pearls and precious stones, gleaming white and multicolored in the morning sun. Ancient stone structures were visible among the tropical vegetation, their architecture suggesting civilizations far older than any known Caribbean settlement. Storm's behavior became increasingly excited as they prepared to make landing. He moved restlessly around the deck, occasionally touching crew members with his nose, as if blessing them for the trials ahead. The horse seemed to understand that reaching the island was only the beginning of their true test. "Drop anchor in the lagoon," Sullivan commanded, studying the crystalline waters that revealed a sandy bottom, despite their considerable depth. "We'll take the longboat ashore." But Storm had other ideas. As the crew prepared the smaller vessel, the horse moved to the ship's rail and without hesitation dove into the mystical waters with a splash that sent rainbow droplets cascading through the air. The crew rushed to the rail, expecting to see Storm swimming toward shore. Instead, they watched in amazement as the horse walked across the water's surface as if it were solid ground, the crystal navigation stone creating a path of light beneath his hooves. "Follow Storm's path," Sullivan ordered, understanding that normal rules didn't apply in these waters. "The light will support us." As they lowered the longboat and began rowing toward the impossible island, Sullivan felt the weight of destiny settling around them. Whatever they found on Morgan's treasure island would change everything. The golden horse statue that dominated the treasure chamber was a perfect replica of Storm, cast in pure gold and adorned with jewels that captured and reflected light from sources that shouldn't have existed in the underground cavern. As Sullivan's crew descended into Morgan's final resting place, following a path that Storm navigated with obvious familiarity, they found themselves face to face with the most magnificent hoard of treasure ever assembled by mortal hands. But it was the statue that commanded their attention, positioned at the chamber's center like a guardian deity surrounded by mountains of gold coins, precious gems, and artifacts from civilizations across the known world. "It's identical to Storm," Tobias whispered, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Every detail, every proportion, like it was cast from light." Storm approached his golden twin with reverent steps, the crystal navigation stone still glowing from his halter, casting dancing lights across the precious metals. When he reached the statue, something extraordinary happened. The golden horse's eyes began to glow with the same inner light as the crystal, and a deep, melodious tone filled the chamber. "Welcome, faithful Storm," a voice spoke from everywhere and nowhere, carrying the authority of someone long dead, but not forgotten. "You have brought worthy successors at last." Sullivan felt his knees weaken as he recognized the voice from legends and tavern tales. Captain Bartholomew Blackheart Morgan, speaking from beyond death, through some mystical connection to his treasure and his loyal companion. 30 years you waited on Devil's Cove," Morgan's spirit continued, addressing Storm directly. 30 years of guarding the secret, testing those who would claim what I have gathered. These men have proven themselves worthy through their treatment of you, my faithful friend." Red Jenny stepped forward, her hand instinctively moving to her cutlass before she remembered they faced no earthly opponent. "Captain Morgan, but you're dead these many years, lass. But some bonds transcend mortality, and some guardianships extend beyond the grave. Storm here isn't just any horse. He's been my companion for longer than your grandfather's grandfather drew breath." The revelation hit the crew like a physical blow. Storm's impossible abilities, his supernatural intelligence, his ageless wisdom all made sense if he existed beyond normal mortal limitations. "How long?" Sullivan asked, studying Storm with new understanding. 2 centuries, give or take a decade," Morgan's voice replied with ghostly humor. "Storm has served as guardian and guide to worthy captains across the Caribbean, but he chose your crew for his final mission, the completion of our greatest quest." The treasure chamber revealed more secrets as Morgan's explanation continued. The walls were covered with murals depicting Storm's adventures with various pirate captains throughout Caribbean history, showing the horse participating in legendary battles and discoveries that had shaped the region's maritime lore. "Every great pirate captain has had Storm's guidance at crucial moments," Morgan explained, though few recognized his true nature. "He appears when the seas need balance, when worthy men require a guardian angel with hooves instead of wings." Storm moved among the treasure piles, touching specific items with his nose. Each artifact he indicated began to glow with soft light, revealing their significance beyond mere monetary value. "The compass of true sight," Morgan narrated, as Storm indicated a jewel-encrusted navigation instrument, "shows not just direction, but the path to one's deepest desires. The sword of justice, which can only be drawn by one who fights for others rather than himself. The crown of understanding, which allows communication with all sea creatures." But Storm passed by the most valuable treasures, moving instead toward a simple wooden chest that seemed insignificant among the golden splendor. When he touched it, the lid opened to reveal documents, maps and personal items that spoke of responsibility rather than wealth. "Ah," Morgan's voice carried approval. "Storm chooses the true treasure, not gold or gems, but knowledge and purpose. That chest contains the locations of every pirate haven, every safe harbor, every refuge where good men can find sanctuary from the world's storms." Sullivan understood the magnitude of what Storm was offering. Not personal wealth, but the means to protect and guide other sailors, other crews who might need the kind of sanctuary that had saved their own lives. "The choice is yours," Morgan concluded. "Take the gold and live as rich men for the rest of your days, or accept Storm's final gift and become guardians yourselves, protectors of those who sail in Storm's wake." Storm looked at Sullivan with eyes that held 2 centuries of wisdom and loyalty, waiting for the decision that would define not just their future, but their legacy in the endless story of the Caribbean seas. The golden statue's eyes continued to glow, illuminating a choice between treasure and purpose that would echo through generations. The cursed cutlass in Eduardo Rodriguez's grip pulsed with malevolent energy, its black blade drinking in the tropical sunlight as the rival pirate captain led his enlarged fleet into the mystical waters surrounding Morgan's Island. Sullivan watched from the treasure chamber's entrance as 7 ships approached their position, each flying the crimson flag of Rodriguez's growing armada. "He's brought half the Caribbean with him," Willem observed grimly, counting the enemy vessels through his spyglass. Word must have spread about Morgan's treasure. Storm stood beside Sullivan, no longer appearing as the rescued animal they had found on Devil's Cove, but revealing himself as the legendary guardian he had always been. His coat gleamed with supernatural luster, his eyes held the wisdom of centuries, and his presence radiated a power that made the very air around them shimmer. "The cursed blade," Morgan's spirit whispered from the golden statue. "Rodriguez has claimed Blackbeard's own cutlass, the sword that feeds on betrayal and grows stronger with each act of treachery. Only pure loyalty can stand against its corruption." Rodriguez's voice carried across the water, amplified by dark magic to reach the island's shores. "Sullivan, I know you're in there with Morgan's horde. Come out and face me like a man, or I'll burn this entire island to ash." The threat was no idle boast. Rodriguez's ships carried enough firepower to reduce the mystical island to rubble, regardless of its supernatural protections. But Storm showed no fear as he walked calmly toward the beach, where Rodriguez was preparing to land with his boarding parties. "The final test," Storm seemed to communicate through his steady gaze at Sullivan. "Everything we've shared leads to this moment." As Rodriguez's longboats reached the pearl-crusted shore, the rival captain leaped onto the beach with the cursed cutlass raised high. The blade's dark energy immediately began affecting the island's mystical properties, causing the golden trees to tarnish and the luminescent creatures to flee. "Where's my treasure, Sullivan?" Rodriguez snarled, advancing with 50 armed pirates behind him. "Where's the hoard that should have been mine by right of strength?" "Strength without honor is just brutality," Sullivan replied, emerging from the treasure chamber with his own crew flanking him. "Morgan's legacy belongs to those who understand its true value." Rodriguez laughed, a sound like grinding metal that made the cursed blade glow brighter. "Spare me your philosophy. I've come for gold, not lectures from a fool who rescues dying animals." The insult to Storm triggered something primal in the supernatural horse. For the first time since joining Sullivan's crew, Storm's eyes flashed with anger, and the ground beneath his hooves began to tremble with barely contained power. "You want to face the real guardian of this treasure?" Sullivan asked, stepping aside to give Storm room to move. "Face him." Storm advanced toward Rodriguez with measured steps, his supernatural nature now fully revealed. With each hoofbeat, the island's mystical energy responded, causing flowers to bloom in his wake, and filling the air with harmonious music that countered the cursed blade's corruption. Rodriguez raised his weapon, its dark power promising victory over any mortal opponent. But as he swung the cursed cutlass toward Storm, something unexpected happened. The blade, which had never met an opponent it couldn't corrupt or destroy, simply passed through Storm as if the horse were made of light and air. What sorcery is this? Rodriguez staggered backward, his invincible weapon useless against an opponent who existed beyond physical harm. Storm's response was to rear up on his hind legs, his front hooves glowing with the same light as the crystal navigation stone. When he struck downward, he didn't aim for Rodriguez's body but for the cursed cutlass itself. The impact shattered the dark blade into 1,000 fragments, each piece dissolving into harmless smoke as Storm's pure loyalty overwhelmed the weapon's corrupting influence. Rodriguez found himself holding nothing but an empty hilt, his supernatural advantage destroyed by a force more powerful than any curse. "Impossible," Rodriguez whispered, falling to his knees on the pearl beach. The blade was unbreakable. Evil can never triumph over loyalty freely given. Storm's meaning was clear even without words, as he stood over the defeated pirate captain with compassion rather than vengeance. The psychological effect on Rodriguez's assembled fleet was immediate. Seeing their legendary leader reduced to helplessness by a horse broke their morale entirely. One by one, the enemy ships began withdrawing from the mystical waters, their crews unwilling to fight against powers they couldn't understand or overcome. Rodriguez himself remained kneeling on the beach, staring at the empty hilt in his hands, as if seeing his entire worldview crumble. The man who had built his reputation on fear and brutality found himself face to face with a force that rendered such weapons meaningless. The blood-stained bandana that Sullivan pressed against Storm's flank told a story of sacrifice that cut deeper than any physical wound. Despite his supernatural nature, the loyal horse had taken a glancing blow from Rodriguez's cursed blade in the final moments of their confrontation, and the dark magic had found its mark even as the weapon shattered. "Easy, boy," Sullivan murmured, his voice thick with emotion as he tended to the injury that should never have been possible. "Easy now." Storm lay on his side on the pearl-white sand, his breathing labored, but his eyes still bright with intelligence and affection. The wound wasn't deep, but the cursed blade's corruption was spreading slowly through his system, fighting against his natural supernatural protections. "He took that hit deliberately," Red Jenny said quietly, kneeling beside them with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Rodriguez was aiming for you, Captain. Storm stepped between you and the blade." The realization hit Sullivan like a physical blow. In the chaos of the final confrontation, he hadn't seen Rodriguez's desperate last attack, the vengeful thrust aimed at Sullivan's heart. But Storm, even while destroying the cursed weapon, had positioned himself to intercept the strike meant for his captain. 200 years of protecting others, Morgan's spirit whispered from the treasure chamber, his voice heavy with sorrow. And still he chooses loyalty over his own safety. The crew gathered around their fallen companion, each man adding his own touch of comfort. Tobias held Storm's head in his lap, whispering gentle words of encouragement. Jorge offered water from his most precious supply. Willem, gruff and practical, found himself arranging a makeshift shelter to protect Storm from the afternoon sun. "Will he?" Pablo couldn't finish the question, but the fear in his young voice spoke for them all. Storm lifted his head with effort, fixing Sullivan with a gaze that held no regret, only contentment at having fulfilled his purpose. The horse's meaning was clear. He had done exactly what he intended to. "The curse is fighting his natural healing," Sullivan observed, watching dark veins spread from the wound, despite his best efforts to clean and bind it. "It's like poison in his system." But Storm had a solution even for this crisis. With careful movements, he indicated the crystal navigation stone still secured to his halter, then nodded toward the golden statue in the treasure chamber. "He wants us to connect him to Morgan's guardian spirit," Sullivan realized. "Use the crystal to strengthen his healing." The process required all of them working together. They carefully moved Storm into the treasure chamber, positioning him beside the golden statue that served as the focal point for Morgan's supernatural presence. The crystal navigation stone began resonating with increased intensity, its light synchronizing with the statue's glowing eyes. "The bond between captain and loyal companion," Morgan's spirit explained, as supernatural energy flowed between the artifacts. It's the strongest magic in all the seas. Your love for Storm and his for you can overcome any curse." Sullivan pressed his hands against Storm's neck, feeling the horse's pulse gradually strengthen as the healing process accelerated. But he sensed something else in the magical connection, a deeper understanding of what Storm's sacrifice truly meant. "You're preparing to leave us, aren't you?" Sullivan asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Storm's gentle nicker confirmed his suspicion. The horse's earthly mission was nearly complete. He had found worthy successors, revealed Morgan's treasure, and defeated the last great threat to Caribbean peace. His 2-century guardianship was reaching its natural conclusion. "But not today," Sullivan said firmly, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect across 3 seas. "Today you rest and heal. Today we take care of you the way you've taken care of us." The healing process continued through the evening and into the night, with crew members taking turns keeping watch over their supernatural friend. By dawn, the cursed wound had sealed completely, leaving only a faint scar as evidence of Storm's sacrifice. But the real transformation was in the crew themselves. The night spent tending to Storm had changed them from pirates seeking treasure into something approaching a family. They had discovered that caring for someone they loved was more valuable than any gold. Rodriguez, still kneeling on the beach where Storm's victory had left him, watched the proceedings with growing understanding. The loyalty he had witnessed between captain and horse represented everything his own pursuit of power had lacked. "Perhaps," he said quietly to himself, "there are treasures more valuable than Spanish gold." The ship's log entry that read Jenny, carefully penned by candlelight in her finest script, would become the stuff of maritime legend, recording for history the impossible deeds they had witnessed aboard the Midnight's Revenge. As word of Storm's miraculous abilities spread through the Caribbean's network of taverns, ports, and pirate havens, sailors from every corner of the known world began seeking out Sullivan's ship for reasons that had nothing to do with plunder. "Captain Sullivan," called a weathered merchant from the docks of Port Royal as they resupplied 3 weeks after their return from Morgan's Island. "Is it true you have a horse that can walk on water and predict storms?" Sullivan smiled, watching Storm graze peacefully in the makeshift corral they had built on the main deck. The supernatural horse had indeed become famous throughout the Caribbean, but not in the way anyone might have expected. "He's more than that," Sullivan replied diplomatically. "He's a reminder that there are still miracles in this world." The transformation in how other sailors viewed them had been dramatic and immediate. Ships that would have once fled from the Midnight's Revenge now approached with flags of truce, their captains hoping for audiences with the legendary horse and his crew. 3 more requests for escort duty, Willem reported, holding a stack of letters from various merchant captains. "They're offering premium rates just for the protection of sailing with Storm." The requests had started small, individual merchants willing to pay extra for safe passage through dangerous waters. But word of Storm's protective abilities had spread, and now entire trading fleets requested their services. Storm himself seemed to understand his new role perfectly. When they escorted merchant convoys, he would position himself at the bow of the Midnight's Revenge, his supernatural senses extended to detect any threats hours before conventional lookouts could spot them. Pirates who might once have attacked defenseless trading vessels now thought twice when they saw Storm's distinctive silhouette on the horizon. "Look at this," Tobias called from the rail, pointing toward an approaching sloop flying the black flag. "Even Rodriguez is coming to pay his respect." Indeed, the former rival captain had undergone his own transformation since their encounter at Morgan's Island. The defeat of his cursed cutlass had somehow freed him from the weapon's corrupting influence, and Eduardo Rodriguez now sailed the Caribbean as something approaching a legitimate privateer. "Permission to come aboard?" Rodriguez called across the water, his tone respectful rather than challenging. "Granted," Sullivan replied, curious to see how this meeting would unfold. Rodriguez approached Storm with obvious reverence, carrying a small wooden box that he presented with both hands extended. "For the horse that taught me the difference between strength and power," he said formally. "A token of gratitude from a man who was lost and has found his way." Storm examined the offered gift with his usual careful intelligence. Inside the box was a simple leather bridle, beautifully crafted, but without ornamentation, representing practical utility rather than flashy display. "I made it myself," Rodriguez explained, his scarred hands showing evidence of the leather work. "Honest labor, for an honest purpose." Storm's acceptance of the gift marked a moment of redemption for the former villain, a recognition that even the most corrupt soul could find a path back to honor. But Storm's influence extended beyond individual conversion. The stories spreading through Caribbean ports spoke of something larger than a supernatural horse. They spoke of loyalty, rewarded, of compassion, returned, of the idea that treating others with respect and kindness could yield greater treasures than any amount of stolen gold. "Ships are changing their flags," Red Jenny observed, watching a former pirate vessel approach flying merchant colors, instead of the traditional black flag. "Crews are choosing honest work over raiding." The phenomenon was becoming widespread. Pirate captains, who heard stories of Storm's loyalty and Sullivan's crew, were reconsidering their life choices, seeking ways to earn respect through protection rather than fear through violence. "The golden age of piracy is ending," Morgan Spirit had told them during their final conversation at the Treasure Island. Storm's mission is to help guide that transition, to show that there are better ways for free men to make their living on the seas. Sullivan found himself at the center of this maritime transformation, with Storm serving as both symbol and catalyst for change throughout the Caribbean. They were no longer just pirates seeking treasure, but guardians helping to create a new kind of order on the high seas. The ship's log entry that would preserve their story for future generations captured more than their adventures. It recorded the birth of a legend that would inspire sailors for centuries to come. The captain's new flag that flew from the mainmast of the Midnight's Revenge bore an image that had never before graced any pirate vessel, a horse and anchor intertwined, symbolizing the union of loyalty and steadfast purpose that had transformed their crew from raiders into protectors. Storm himself had helped design the banner, carefully selecting the colors and positioning when Sullivan spread various fabric samples across the deck. "It's beautiful," Red Jenny said, watching the flag snap proudly in the Caribbean breeze. "Shows the whole world what we've become." The transformation of Sullivan's leadership style had been gradual but profound, evolving from the authoritarian command structure typical of pirate ships into something resembling a family council where every voice mattered. Storm's influence had taught them that true strength came not from dominance but from the willing cooperation of those who shared common values. "What do you think about taking on the Seabird's escort contract?" Sullivan asked during their morning planning session, spreading charts across the makeshift table they had constructed near Storm's shelter. "Captain Martinez is offering good rates, but the route takes us through waters where that new pirate confederation has been active." Instead of simply issuing orders, Sullivan now consulted his crew on major decisions, valuing their experience and insights in ways that would have seemed impossible during his purely predatory days. "The Seabirds got family aboard," Tobias pointed out, studying the proposed route. "Women and children traveling to start a new life in Jamaica. They need protection more than most." Storm's approval was evident in his gentle nicker and the way he moved closer to the charts, studying the planned course with his supernatural understanding of Caribbean water. His presence at their planning sessions had become routine, his insights valued as much as any human crew members. "Storm agrees," Willem observed, watching the horse trace a safer alternative route with his nose. "And he's suggesting we take the southern approach, avoid those reefs where pirates like to set ambushes." The decision-making process that would have once taken Sullivan minutes of solitary consideration now involved lengthy discussions where practical concerns mixed with ethical considerations about their responsibilities as protectors rather than predators. But Storm's influence extended beyond their own ship. The Midnight's Revenge had become a sanctuary for rescued animals, a floating refuge for creatures that other ships might have abandoned or ignored. Storm had somehow communicated to other sea creatures that their vessel was a safe haven, and Sullivan frequently found injured seabirds, exhausted dolphins, and even lost sea turtles seeking shelter in their wake. We're becoming a regular Noah's Ark, Jorge laughed, watching Storm carefully tend to a young pelican with a damaged wing. That horse has appointed himself caretaker to every creature in the Caribbean. The ship's design had been modified to accommodate their growing menagerie. Additional water barrels provided fresh drinking water for various animals, while sections of the deck had been converted into recovery areas for creatures that needed time to heal before returning to the wild. Storm supervised these rescue operations with the same attention he gave to navigation and weather prediction, somehow knowing exactly what each creature needed for recovery. His veterinary instinct seemed as supernatural as his other abilities, guided by an understanding of animal physiology that surpassed that of trained ship surgeons. He's teaching us about responsibility, Sullivan reflected, watching Storm demonstrate to young Pablo how to properly bandage a sea turtle's injured flipper, showing us that power should be used to protect rather than exploit. The crew's commitment to their new mission had deepened with each successful rescue and safe escort. Men who had once measured success in terms of gold stolen and ships plundered now found greater satisfaction in lives saved and families safely delivered to their destination. Their reputation as protectors, rather than predators, had attracted a different kind of crew member as well. Former naval officers disillusioned with corrupt governments, merchant sailors tired of working for greedy trading companies, and even reformed pirates seeking redemption had begun requesting positions aboard the Midnight's Revenge. "We're not just changing ourselves," Red Jenny observed during one of their evening planning sessions. "We're showing other sailors that there are alternatives to the old ways." Storm's contentment with their transformation was evident in everything from his relaxed posture during their daily routines to his increasingly playful interactions with both crew and rescued animals. The horse, who had been found starving and alone on Devil's Cove, had become the heart of a community dedicated to helping others in similar distress. The flag bearing their horse and anchor symbol had become a beacon of hope throughout the Caribbean, recognized by honest sailors as a promise of aid and by corrupt officials as a warning that some crews could not be intimidated or bored. The memorial plaque that Sullivan and his crew installed at Devil's Cove bore a simple inscription that would guide future sailors for generations to come. Here Storm waited. Here loyalty was rewarded. Here hope was reborn. Cast in bronze and mounted on the weathered stone where they had first found the starving horse, the marker served both as commemoration and promise to any soul who might find themselves abandoned on these shores. "It feels right, coming back here," Tobias said, running his hand along the plaque's smooth surface. "Like completing a circle that started the day we found Storm." Storm himself stood at the water's edge, no longer the skeletal, desperate creature they had rescued months ago, but a magnificent being whose supernatural nature was now fully revealed. His coat gleamed with health and something beyond health. His eyes held the wisdom of centuries, and his presence seemed to bless the very ground beneath his hooves. The cove had been transformed by their return. Where once only barren sand and scattered driftwood had marked the shoreline, now fresh water springs bubbled from the rocks and fruit trees, heavy with nourishment, grew in impossible abundance. Storm's influence had made Devil's Cove into a place of refuge rather than despair. "Look at this," Red Jenny called from deeper in the island's interior, where she had discovered structures that definitely hadn't existed during their first visit. "There are shelters here, fresh water, food stores, everything a stranded sailor would need." Sullivan understood immediately. Storm was preparing Devil's Cove to serve future castaways, the way Morgan's Treasure Island had served as a mystical sanctuary. This remote spot would become a place where those who had lost hope could find the resources necessary to survive until rescue arrived. "He's creating a legacy," Sullivan realized, watching Storm carefully inspect each of the new shelters as if ensuring they met his exacting standards, making sure no one else has to suffer what he endured during his years of waiting. The crew worked throughout the day, adding their own contributions to Storm's preparations. Jorge established a smokehouse for preserving fish and stocked it with salt and other necessities. Willem constructed rain catchment systems to ensure fresh water would always be available. Pablo and Tobias built signal fires that could be lit to attract passing ships. But it was Storm's final gift that moved them most deeply. As the sun began setting on their day of preparation, the horse led them to a cave they hadn't noticed before, its entrance hidden behind flowering vines that seemed to glow with inner light. Inside, they discovered a sight that left them speechless. The walls were covered with murals depicting Storm's adventures throughout Caribbean history, showing his partnerships with various captains and crews across 2 centuries of service. But at the center of the cave, a new mural had appeared, showing Sullivan and his crew alongside Storm in scenes from their own journey together. "He's painted our story," Willem said in wonder, studying images that captured everything from Storm's rescue to their battles with Rodriguez to their discovery of Morgan's treasure. "Our whole adventure, preserved for anyone who comes after." At the mural's end, new images were still appearing, as if painted by an invisible hand, guided by Storm's memories. These showed not past events, but future possibilities. Other crews finding the cave, reading their story, and being inspired to choose loyalty over greed, protection over predation. "This is how legends begin," Sullivan said quietly, understanding that their adventure was becoming something larger than personal experience. "This is how the best of human nature gets passed down through generations." Storm approached each crew member individually as evening deepened, offering gestures of affection that felt like formal farewells. To Tobias, a gentle nuzzle that conveyed paternal pride in the young man's growth. To Red Jenny, a respectful bow that acknowledged her strength and wisdom. To Willem, a touch that forgave old skepticism and praised newfound loyalty. To Jorge, Pablo, and the others, individual moments of connection that honored their unique contributions to their shared story. Finally, Storm came to Sullivan, pressing his forehead against the captain's chest in a gesture that communicated gratitude, love, and something approaching benediction. "You're not leaving us," Sullivan said, though he already sensed the truth. "You're just beginning the next phase of your guardianship." Storm's gentle nicker confirmed what Sullivan suspected. The supernatural horse's earthly mission with this particular crew was complete, but his larger purpose would continue. Other sailors would need guidance. Other crews would require the kind of transformative influence that only Storm could provide. As they sailed away from Devil's Cove the following morning, Sullivan looked back to see Storm standing on the shore, no longer appearing as a mortal horse, but as something approaching a guardian spirit, watching over the sanctuary he had created for future souls in need of hope. The memorial plaque caught the morning sunlight, its message clear to any who might read it. Some bonds transcend mortality, some loyalties echo through eternity, and some legends never truly end.